On a summer morning in 1993, a small funeral took place in Memphis, Tennessee. No press conference. No breaking news alert. Just a private service for a woman named Delta Mae Presley Biggs, laid to rest at Forest Hill Cemetery. Most of the world didn't notice. But inside the gates of Graceland, something quietly ended that day. For 11 years, while millions of strangers walked through Elvis Presley's mansion snapping photographs and reading plaques, one woman was still living there, behind a door the tour guides were instructed never to open. That woman was Elvis's aunt, and she may be the closest thing to a living witness that Graceland ever had. Long before she became a strange footnote in rock and roll history, Delta Mae Presley was simply the younger sister of Vernon Presley, which made her Elvis's aunt by blood, not by marriage or circumstance. She was born in Mississippi in 1919, the daughter of Jesse and Minnie Mae Presley, and she grew up in the same rural hardscrabble world that produced the rest of the Presley family. In 1940, she married a man named Eugene "Pat" Biggs, and for roughly a quarter century, she lived a life that had nothing to do with fame. She wasn't a Presley waiting in the wings. She was just a working-class Mississippi wife, largely unknown outside her own family circle, while her nephew grew from a shy Memphis teenager into the most talked-about entertainer on the planet. Everything changed in the mid-1960s. When Pat Biggs died, Delta was left without a husband and without children of her own to lean on. According to accounts documented by Graceland historians, Elvis didn't simply send condolences from a distance. He dispatched members of his inner circle to help arrange the funeral, and he personally arranged to bring his aunt back to Memphis. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. He gave her a home, and in a detail that says something about how Elvis handled family loyalty, he formally put her on his household payroll as a housekeeper, giving her both a purpose and financial independence inside the walls of Graceland. That single decision is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about the man behind the myth. Elvis didn't just let his aunt move in as a guest. He gave her a role, a paycheck, and a permanent place in the household, the same instinct that led him to house his grandmother, his father, and a rotating cast of relatives and friends throughout his adult life. Fame had already made Elvis larger than life by the mid-1960s, but inside Graceland's walls, he was still operating like the head of an extended Southern family, the kind where nobody gets left to fend for themselves. It's worth pausing on how ordinary that arrangement would have looked from the inside, even though it was happening inside one of the most famous addresses in the country. A widow loses her husband. A relative steps in to help. She's given a room, a job, and a reason to get up in the morning. Families have leaned on each other this way for generations, in farmhouses and apartments and small-town duplexes all over the country. The only unusual part was the address. Everything else about it was simply what families do. There's also something worth noting about the timing. Delta arrived at Graceland in the mid-1960s, a period when Elvis's career was quietly restructuring itself. The explosive rock and roll stardom of the 1950s had given way to a decade of Hollywood film contracts, and while the movies kept his name in front of audiences, they were widely regarded, even by Elvis himself, according to numerous accounts from people close to him at the time, as creatively unsatisfying. Into that particular chapter of his life walked his aunt, someone who had known him since long before any of it started, someone who wasn't impressed by sound stages or studio contracts, someone who simply wanted to make sure the coffee was on in the morning. For a man surrounded by managers, agents, and handlers, that kind of unglamorous familiarity may have mattered more than anyone outside the house ever fully appreciated. Elvis purchased Graceland in 1957, when he was only 22 years old and already the biggest name in American music. It's easy to think of the mansion as a monument to one man's success, but that was never really the intention. From the beginning, Elvis bought it as a family compound. His parents, Vernon and Gladys, moved in immediately. His grandmother, Minnie Mae Presley, took up residence and stayed for decades. And when Delta arrived in the years after her husband's death, she simply became the newest addition to a household that had always been built around more than just its most famous resident. By the time Delta settled into Graceland, she was living alongside Minnie May, sharing a roof with a nephew whose career was moving through some of its most turbulent chapters: the Hollywood movie years, the 1968 comeback special, and eventually the marathon Las Vegas residencies that would come to define the final act of his life. She wasn't reading about any of it in magazines the way the rest of the world was. She was down the hall. That kind of proximity is rare in the story of any global celebrity, let alone one as mythologized as Elvis Presley. Biographers, journalists, and fans have spent decades reconstructing his life from concert footage, second-hand interviews, and press clippings. Delta didn't need any of that second-hand material. She simply lived it, day after day, for years, inside a house that the rest of the world could only imagine from behind a fence. Picture the sheer range of what that meant in practical terms. In a single decade, Delta went from watching her nephew film lightweight studio musicals in California to watching him rehearse for the Black Leather, career-redefining television special that reintroduced him as a serious performer in 1968, to watching him prepare for the grueling high-intensity Las Vegas shows that would consume much of his final years. Most fans experience those chapters of Elvis's career as separate, almost unconnected eras, spaced out across magazine covers and album releases. Delta experienced them as a single continuous stretch of ordinary life, punctuated by an unusual amount of packing, touring schedules, and late-night homecomings. But a household built around global fame is never a simple one. Every person living under that roof, however loved, however secure, absorbed some version of the pressure that came with being connected to the most recognized face on earth. Fans gathered outside the gates at all hours. The demands on Elvis's time rarely let up, and the family members closest to him lived inside that intensity whether they had signed up for it or not. Delta's world was one of genuine comfort and security, but it was also one shaped, every single day, by the strange gravity of celebrity. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died at Graceland. He was 42 years old. It remains one of the most exhaustively documented events in American cultural history, confirmed by medical examiners and reported globally within hours, a fact that has never been seriously disputed by any credible source in the decades since. For the family living inside those walls, though, it wasn't a headline. It was the sudden, permanent end of the household as they'd known it. Delta had lived under that roof for roughly a decade at that point, long enough to watch her nephew evolve through nearly every stage of his adult career. And now, without warning, the center of that household was gone. What followed was not a single dramatic ending but a slow, quiet unraveling. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, died less than 2 years later, in 1979. Minnie May Presley, the grandmother who had shared the house with Delta for over a decade, passed away in 1980. One by one, the people who had filled Graceland with the ordinary noise of family life were gone, and the rooms that had once been full started to feel, increasingly, like an echo of what they used to be. That left Delta as effectively the last member of the immediate Presley household still living inside the mansion. Try to imagine what those years actually felt like from inside those walls. The mansion had been designed, furnished, and filled with the energy of a large, extended family, a household built for holiday dinners, for a famous nephew coming and going at odd hours with an entourage in tow. By the early 1980s, almost all of that was gone. The estate itself remained frozen, largely unchanged from the way it looked when Elvis died, a decision the family made deliberately to preserve his memory. But the people who had once filled it were disappearing one by one, and Delta was left to walk through rooms that had once been loud and were now, for the most part, simply quiet. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that stretch of time, a period rarely discussed in the countless retrospectives about Elvis's life and legacy. The cameras and the magazine writers were interested in the king. They were not particularly interested in the aging woman quietly keeping his childhood home running in the years after everyone else had left it. By the early 1980s, the estate faced an enormous financial and logistical challenge. Graceland was expensive to maintain, and its cultural significance had grown far beyond what any private family could quietly manage on its own. Priscilla Presley, acting on behalf of Lisa Marie Presley's estate, made the decision to open the mansion to the public as a way to preserve it and make it financially sustainable. Graceland officially opened its doors on June 7, 1982. According to Graceland's own historical records, more than 3,000 fans lined up on that very first day to walk through a home that, until recently, had been entirely private. And in one of the more striking details of that opening, it wasn't only Priscilla who welcomed the public. Delta Biggs herself, alongside Elvis Presley Enterprises CEO Jack Sodden, helped cut the ceremonial ribbon that opened the mansion to tourists. The last surviving resident of the Presley household was, quite literally, present at the moment her home became a museum. But opening day wasn't just a ceremonial milestone for Delta. It meant something far more personal. Her actual bedroom, tucked near the kitchen, and the kitchen itself were about to sit just steps away from a public walking tour, and she had no intention of leaving. So an arrangement was made. Her private quarters were kept off the official tour route, closed to visitors, allowing her to continue living the way she always had, even as thousands of strangers moved through the rest of the house every single day. Think about the strangeness of that compromise for a moment. Very few people in history have had to negotiate the terms of their own privacy inside their own bedroom while their home simultaneously became a national tourist attraction. It wasn't a hypothetical concern, either. Graceland's popularity only grew throughout the 1980s, eventually drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors a year, all funneled through hallways just steps from where Delta cooked her meals and put her dog to bed at night. The estate's management, to its credit, treated her presence not as an inconvenience to be worked around, but as something worth actively protecting. For the next 11 years, Graceland operated as two completely different places depending on the hour. During the day, it functioned like clockwork. Tour groups moving past the white staircase, the piano room, and the jungle room on a carefully managed schedule, everything curated for maximum reverence toward a man who was no longer there. And just a few feet from all of it, behind a door tourists were never permitted to open. An older woman quietly went about an ordinary life, with, according to Graceland's own records, a small dog named Edmund by her side. Family accounts, including recollections shared over the years by Elvis's daughter Lisa Marie Presley, describe Delta as sharp-tongued, headstrong, and not remotely interested in playing the role of a museum exhibit. Genealogical records describing her personality note that she was known both for her strong opinions and for what relatives affectionately called a loving spirit underneath the toughness. She had spent her whole life as a private person, and fame, even by association, never fully suited her. There's a story that has circulated for years among people close to the family. When curious tourists occasionally spotted her walking her dog near the mansion and asked whether she was Aunt Delta, she would sometimes simply tell them that Delta had died the night before, and keep walking. It's the kind of dry, deadpan response that says more about a person's character than a dozen formal interviews ever could. This wasn't a woman auditioning for a role in someone else's legend. She was just trying to walk her dog in peace. At night, once the last tour group filed out and the gates were locked, the house reportedly became hers again in a way it couldn't be during daylight hours. Graceland's own archivists have noted that Delta would sometimes rearrange small elements of the home during those quiet hours, a small, human act of ownership over a space that had technically become the property of an estate but that had once simply been her home. She reportedly weighed in on conversations with Graceland's leadership about how faithfully the decor from Elvis's final years should be preserved, a reminder that for her, the mansion was never just a historical exhibit. It was still, in some very real sense, a house she lived in. If you search online for Delta Biggs today, you'll find no shortage of breathless claims that she exposed some hidden scandal about Elvis before she died, a secret affair, a cover-up, a bombshell confession. It's worth being direct about this. There is no credible documentation, from Graceland's official historical materials, family recollections, or contemporary news coverage, of Delta ever revealing some explosive hidden truth about her nephew. The Associated Press obituary that ran at the time of her death in 1993 described her plainly as Elvis's aunt and a longtime Graceland housekeeper, not as a whistleblower or a source of scandal. What she actually represented was something quieter and, in its own way, more valuable, an unbroken, decades-long, first-hand perspective on what it was genuinely like to be part of Elvis Presley's inner circle while the rest of the world was busy turning him into a myth. She wasn't defending a brand or protecting an image. She had known the Presleys before any of them were famous, and she remained close to that family long after fame reshaped every other part of their lives. That's a rarer position than it might sound. Nearly everyone who has ever written or spoken publicly about Elvis Presley has done so from the outside. Biographers working from interviews, journalists working from archival footage, fans working from concert recordings. Delta didn't need second-hand material. She lived inside the story for more than a quarter of a century, through the peak of her nephew's fame, through his death, and through the transformation of his home into one of the most visited private residences in the United States. Delta Biggs died on July 29, 1993, at the age of 74. Her funeral, like much of her life at Graceland, was kept private, away from public attention. She was buried at Forest Hill Cemetery Midtown in Memphis. What happened next carries its own quiet symbolism. Her bedroom, the one space tourists had never been permitted to see during her lifetime, was restored to reflect how it had looked decades earlier, during the years Elvis's parents lived in the house. And the kitchen, the room she had guarded as part of her private living space for over a decade, was finally added to the official Graceland tour the following year, in 1994. The last physical barrier between family home and public museum disappeared within roughly a year of her death, as though the house itself had been waiting for her to finish living in it before it could fully complete its transformation into a landmark. Delta Biggs never gave a tell-all interview. She never sat for a network special promising shocking new revelations about her famous nephew. What she left behind instead was something less sensational but arguably more meaningful, proof that even inside the most visited private home in America, an ordinary family life had genuinely existed, with all its warmth, its routines, its tension, and its grief. She represented a living link between two very different versions of Graceland, the noisy, imperfect family home it had been for decades, and the polished cultural landmark it eventually became. For 11 years after the gates opened to the public, that link was still walking the halls at night, feeding her dog, and quietly deciding where the furniture belonged. Millions of visitors have walked through Graceland since 1982, staring up at the gold records in the hallway and standing respectfully in the meditation garden where Elvis is buried alongside his parents and grandmother. Almost none of them ever knew that for more than a decade, someone was still living just a few feet from the velvet ropes, finishing out an ordinary life inside a house the rest of the world had already turned into a monument. That, in the end, may be the real story Delta Biggs left behind. Not a scandal. Not a secret. Just a reminder that behind every legend, there was still a family, and until 1993, there was still someone there to turn off the lights. Sources referenced: Graceland Official Archives and blog, Graceland.com, Find a Grave Memorial Records, WikiTree Genealogical Records, Contemporary 1993 Associated Press Obituary Coverage, Family Recollections attributed to Lisa Marie Presley as reported in Graceland Historical Materials.